In the spring of 1959, one of the most successful recording artists in America signed away nearly everything he owned so that he could end his marriage in a hurry and wed the widow of his closest friend. 5 years later, standing at the edge of a Roman film set, he watched his wife conduct an affair in front of the world's press while his own career quietly finished dying. Eddie Fisher paid an extraordinary price to become Elizabeth Taylor's fourth husband. By the end, she could barely stand to hear his name. So what did the wrecked reputation and the emptied bank account actually buy him, and why did Taylor, a woman who never lacked for scandal, speak of this particular marriage with something closer to shame than to regret? Join me to find out. The story begins with a death rather than a romance. In 1958, the producer Mike Todd, Elizabeth Taylor's third husband, died in a plane crash, and at 26, she found herself a widow. Their marriage had run to barely more than a year. Biographers writing decades later still treat that crash as the hinge on which the whole of her following decade turns, and the 6 years covered by this video make very little sense without it. What we know of her state of mind in those weeks reaches us secondhand, filtered through memoirs written by people with reputations to defend and books to sell. Taylor addressed the period herself only much later in a book ostensibly about weight and self-image, where she framed the years after Todd's death as grief she could not manage alone. Her summary of her own condition then: an overwhelming inability to be by herself. One hesitates to lean too hard on a single sentence composed 30 years after the fact, though it accounts for a great deal of what followed. Eddie Fisher counted Mike Todd as his closest friend. At the time of the crash, he also ranked among the phenomenally successful pop singers in America, with a national television variety show and a recording career sitting near the top of the charts. When Todd died, Fisher stepped in to console the widow, and the consolation did not stay consolation for long. Within a short period, the two of them had embarked on an affair. Proximity and grief finished the job. How much calculation entered into it on either side we cannot now determine. Fisher's own account, published 40 years afterwards, presents the whole business as a helpless collision, a love he could neither resist nor regret. Biographers have proved a good deal less charitable, and the sequence of events invites the skepticism, since the grieving woman he comforted happened to be among the most photographed and most bankable performers alive. One practical problem sat in plain view from the start. Fisher already belonged to somebody else. Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher shared two children, Carrie and Todd, and the four of them existed in the public imagination as something close to a national mascot. Studio publicists marketed the family as an idealized, wholesome Hollywood household, and the American public accepted that portrait as documentary truth. Publicists assembled such images routinely in that era. For the people living inside them, though, the images amounted to obligations with no exit clause attached. To understand the violence of what followed, you need some sense of how the mid-century publicity machine actually operated. Stars did not simply act in films or sing on television. The studios built them into narratives, sold those narratives to the fan magazines, and audiences bought the narratives as readily as they bought tickets. A performer who broke character in public did not merely embarrass himself, he broke a contract with millions of strangers who believed they held a stake in the outcome, and no studio possessed the power to soften what came back at him. Fisher would break that contract about as conspicuously as the machinery allowed. The divorce came with a bill, and Fisher paid it with very little argument. California law imposed a waiting period on divorcing couples at the time, and Fisher wanted no waiting period whatsoever, because Taylor stood available and the press already circled the story. His solution? Hand over the bulk of his assets and purchase Reynolds' cooperation outright. Speed cost money, and money he still possessed. The terms reported at the time indicate how badly he wanted the thing finished. Reynolds kept their Palm Springs ranch and a West Los Angeles home valued at $125,000, along with 7 life insurance policies, custody of both children, and $36,000 in initial alimony. Fisher walked away from a marriage and a fortune in a single transaction, treating the money as the smaller of the two losses, which in strict financial terms it may well have proved. The other cost he incurred that spring took rather longer to arrive. After a highly publicized separation, the divorce came through, and on May 12, 1959, in a Jewish ceremony in Las Vegas, Eddie Fisher married Elizabeth Taylor. Barely a year separated Mike Todd's death from that wedding. Nobody in America failed to notice the speed of it, and the fan magazines had already begun assembling the story they would run for the next 5 years. The reaction arrived at once, and it fell with real cruelty, though it did not fall evenly across the three people involved. Tabloids and mainstream magazines alike turned on Taylor with a ferocity that reads, from the present day, closer to collective punishment than to a series of individual editorial decisions. They branded her a husband stealer, and the coarser publications reached for the phrase home-wrecking slut. Reynolds drew almost universal sympathy in the same weeks: the innocent party, the wronged mother left holding 2 small children. Her casting had been settled before anyone thought to ask her about it. An asymmetry runs through all of this, and the gender politics of the period explains it without excusing it. A married man abandoned his wife and children, yet the woman he left them for absorbed the greater share of public fury, cast as a predator who reached into a family and removed the husband by force. Fisher did not escape untouched. The character assigned to him simply differed in kind, since the public rapidly reframed him as an opportunist rather than as a monster. That distinction carried commercial consequences. Audiences will pay to watch a woman they consider dangerous, and Taylor's box office survived the scandal intact, arguably strengthened by it. Audiences will not, as a rule, pay to hear a man they consider grasping sing sentimental ballads about devotion. The economics of scandals split along lines bearing very little relation to who had done what to whom, and Fisher landed on the wrong side of that split before he had finished unpacking in his new house. Damage to Fisher's professional standing proved permanent. In 1959, his national television variety show met cancellation, a direct casualty of the negative publicity and the shifting public morals of the moment, and he retreated from mainstream broadcasting into nightclub work. For a performer accustomed to a weekly national audience, the clubs represented a demotion that everyone in the industry could read at a glance. He moved from the middle of American living rooms into rooms where people drank while he sang. Fisher always attributed the collapse to the marriage, and to Taylor in particular. Historians treat that explanation with considerable suspicion, since his career had already begun faltering before the scandal broke, undermined by the arrival of rock and roll, which turned the polished balladeers of the previous decade into relics of somebody else's youth. The backlash from the divorce accelerated a decline arriving anyway. Taylor supplied a convenient scapegoat for a professional obsolescence that no marriage could have caused or prevented. Here, the historical record and the participant's own account cannot both hold, and the participant enjoyed every reason to prefer his own. A singer whose style falls out of fashion through a generational shift in taste counts merely as unlucky. A performer who sacrificed a great career for a great love achieves something more dignified than bad luck, and the whole difference between those two men lies in the telling rather than in the facts. Fisher spent his remaining 4 decades telling the second version. Almost everything we know about the daily texture of the Taylor-Fisher household descends from Fisher's 1999 autobiography, Been There, Done That, and that fact should give any careful reader pause. The book amounts to a single-party account, composed 40 years after the events it describes by a man with an obvious interest in how posterity would understand them. Historians read it as evidence of what Fisher wanted believed. With that caveat firmly in place, his version still repays examination because it constitutes very nearly all we possess. In the memoir, Fisher claims he abandoned his own singing career and reorganized his life around Taylor's needs, describing himself taking her to emergency rooms, managing her staff, and looking after her children and even her pets. Taylor's health problems during these years ran real and frequently serious, so nobody disputes the emergency rooms. The dispute concerns the framing. A man already deserted by his audience presents himself as a man who nobly set that audience aside, and the two descriptions cover exactly the same empty diary. Reading his account against the biographers, a picture emerges of a marriage in which the power ran overwhelmingly in one direction. Taylor commanded the money, the fame, the professional momentum, and the public fascination, while Fisher supplied logistics. Whether he chose that role out of devotion as he insisted to the end, or drifted into it because nothing else remained open to a nightclub act with a wrecked reputation, the effect on the marriage stayed identical. A husband who becomes staff rarely keeps the standing of a husband. Another force worked on the marriage from the inside, and to his credit, Fisher documented it openly rather than hiding it. Throughout this period, he received methamphetamine injections from his physician, and the addiction escalated across the years with Taylor. The practice did not operate underground in the way a modern listener might assume. Certain doctors serving wealthy clients in that era dispensed amphetamine injections as a treatment for fatigue and low mood, and their patients included performers who needed to appear energetic on demand. That particular medical fashion ruined a number of people, and Fisher belonged among them. Chronic methamphetamine use produces paranoia, erratic judgment, sleeplessness, and a general erosion of the personality, none of which improves a marriage already strained by press attention and professional humiliation. Reading his memoir with this in mind complicates the question of reliability further still. A man recalling 4 decades later a period through which he moved continuously and heavily intoxicated qualifies not simply as a biased witness but as an impaired one. By 1962, the imbalance inside the marriage had stopped being a matter of temperament and turned into a matter of accounting. Taylor's fee for Cleopatra exceeded anything an actress had been paid before in the history of the medium, and she collected it while her husband worked rooms in which the audience faced a bar rather than a stage. Money of that order does not sit quietly in a household. It decides who travels where, whose schedule the other person arranges himself around, and who spends the afternoon on the telephone to a doctor about somebody else's appointment. The Cleopatra production had already become a byword for chaos within the industry. Filming ran long, costs climbed, and the whole enterprise drew the sort of press attention that converts every private arrangement on a set into public property. Into that environment walked Fisher, a man whose only remaining public identity attached itself to the woman at the center of the storm. He held no work of his own in Rome, no reason to be there beyond her, and the Italian photographers grasped that arrangement long before he admitted it to himself. The end arrived on a film set. In 1962, Taylor worked in Rome opposite Richard Burton, a Welsh actor of formidable reputation and equally formidable appetites. He belonged to somebody else, and so did she. Neither circumstance slowed anything down. The affair began during the production and proceeded with an openness bordering on provocation. Fisher's own affair 3 years earlier had at least started in private before the press caught up with it. This one played out in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, and on the streets of Rome in front of photographers who understood exactly what they held. Italian magazines pursued the story with an enthusiasm their American counterparts could only envy. Within weeks, Liz and Dick operated as a phenomenon quite separate from either performer's actual work, and the film itself became almost incidental to the coverage. Fisher's position across these months invites pity in the exact sense of the word. He had traded a family, a fortune, a career, and the goodwill of an entire country for this marriage. And now the global press fixated on the couple who had replaced him while he watched from the edge of the frame. 3 years earlier, the public knew him as the man who stole Elizabeth Taylor. Now they knew him as the man Elizabeth Taylor discarded, which counts as a considerably less useful thing to be in a business built on public sympathy. Whatever affection Taylor once felt had curdled by this point into something colder. The clearest surviving evidence of her feelings comes from Richard Burton's diaries, and it does not read gently. Writing in 1966, 2 years after her divorce from Fisher, Burton recorded that Taylor felt deep shame about her fourth marriage. and he quoted her dismissal of Fisher as a fool who ranked beneath contempt, together with a comparison to a boot that manages to sound contemptuous and faintly comic at once. Nothing else in the record catches her private voice on the subject. One hesitates to build too much on a diary entry since Burton recorded his wife's remarks about her previous husband, a subject on which he hardly qualified as a neutral observer. The entry still counts for something, because he wrote it privately rather than for publication, and because nothing in the surrounding record contradicts it. Taylor never attacked Fisher publicly in comparable terms. Her published account of the period treats the marriage as a symptom of grief rather than as a relationship worth discussing on its own terms, which in its way cuts deeper than any insult, since an insult at least concedes that its target existed. The legal ending proceeded at speed and at a distance. On March 6, 1964, Fisher and Taylor divorced in Puerto Vallarta in the Mexican state of Jalisco. Mexican divorces of this kind supplied a familiar instrument for people whose circumstances rendered the domestic courts inconvenient, and the choice of venue indicates how urgently the two of them needed the matter concluded. The urgency becomes obvious from what came next. 9 days later, on March 15, 1964, Taylor married Richard Burton in Montreal. 9 days. Fisher had bought his way out of one marriage to enter this one, surrendering houses, insurance policies, and the affection of the American public along the way, and the interval between his removal and his replacement amounted to a little over a week. The symmetry with 1959 seems to have escaped him entirely, since the memoir he published 35 years later shows no trace of a man who ever recognized himself in the role he once assigned to Debbie Reynolds. Fisher's account appeared in 1999, and it reads strangely even now. Toward Taylor, he maintained a posture of tragic romance to the end, writing that even had he known how much pain his love for her would cost, he still wouldn't have hesitated. 40 years on, he still told the story as a love story, still casting himself as a man undone by feeling rather than by rock and roll and his own judgment. The pose had survived 4 decades without much revision. Toward Reynolds, he showed no such generosity. In the same book, he attacked his first wife at length, accusing her of self-absorption, relentless ambition, insecurity, dishonesty, and a manufactured public persona, and suggesting she deserved an Academy Award for her performance as the wronged woman. The accusation repays a moment's attention. Fisher argued that the woman he abandoned, whose home he broke apart, had cynically performed her own distress for public advantage, a claim nobody can falsify, and one that, coming from him, verges on the grotesque. His own family settled the question of reliability more efficiently than any historian could. Carrie Fisher, by then a writer of considerable reputation herself, mocked the memoir publicly, remarking that reading her father's version left her wanting her DNA fumigated. When a man's child treats his autobiography as a contaminant, source evaluation grows noticeably simpler. The joke also happens to be accurate. It is worth pausing over what this story actually rests on. No neutral witness exists anywhere in the material. The record consists of one autobiography by an addicted man looking back across 4 decades, one private diary kept by the man who replaced him and published posthumously by a university press, one self-help book in which Taylor touched on her marriages while writing about something else entirely, a family memoir published by Todd Fisher in 2018, and a handful of magazine reports filed while the events unfolded. Every one of those documents came from somebody with an interest in the outcome. Each of these carries a different distortion, and the distortions do not cancel one another out. Contemporary reporting from 1959 captures the financial terms of the Reynolds settlement with some precision, yet it carries the moral assumptions of the fan magazine world that produced it, a world with a commercial interest in villains. Burton's diaries preserve Taylor's private speech more directly than anything else we possess, though they preserve it through the ear of a rival. The biographers who came later worked at enough remove to weigh these accounts against one another. Their distance is precisely why Mann's reading diverges so sharply from Fisher's. Historians dealing with this period rarely enjoy the luxury of a document written by someone with nothing to gain. Everyone involved earned money from the telling, and the telling itself formed part of the careers under discussion. That does not render the record useless. It does mean that the confident version of this marriage, the one circulating in anniversary retrospectives and clip compilations, rests on foundations a good deal shakier than its confidence suggests. One more turn belongs to this story, and it belongs to the two women rather than to the man who came between them. In 1966, Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor met aboard the Queen Elizabeth, reconciled, and resumed the friendship that Fisher's affair had destroyed 7 years earlier. Neither woman appears to have found it difficult. The scandal that had consumed the American press for the better part of a decade turned out, for the two people supposedly at war over it, to amount to something settled in conversation on an ocean liner. The final joke arrived 35 years after that shipboard meeting. In 2001, Reynolds and Taylor appeared together in the television film These Old Broads, written by Carrie Fisher, which included a thinly disguised and heavily satirized character based on Eddie Fisher. Both women, along with the daughter he had left behind, mocked the whole affair on screen for a national audience. Fisher spent his life insisting the triangle amounted to a tragedy, while the other three participants concluded it amounted to material. 3 incompatible versions of this marriage survive, and the gaps between them run wide enough to drive a career through. Fisher's version casts him as a man who gave up his standing, his money, and his art to nurse a demanding and physically fragile woman, only to find himself thrown aside the moment a more interesting man walked onto a soundstage in Rome. Taylor's version, delivered sparingly and late, treats the whole thing as a catastrophe of grief. In her telling, the grief did the choosing. Biographers hold to a third reading in which neither party quite authored events, and the collision of studio-era image-making, unrelenting press scrutiny, and real bereavement produced an outcome that neither of them controlled. Historical consensus leans toward the view that Taylor never regarded Fisher as an equal to Todd or to Burton, and that she treated him as an emotional crutch during a period when almost nothing else steadied her. He lacked the size in the theatrical sense of the men who preceded and followed him. Once the grief that drew the two of them together began to lift, too little remained underneath to hold a marriage in place. That reading treats Fisher unkindly, and it fits the evidence better than his own. What stays unresolved, and will probably stay unresolved, concerns motive at the very beginning. We cannot be sure whether Eddie Fisher fell in love with his dead friend's widow or spotted an opportunity and pursued it, and the two possibilities exclude one another far less neatly than either camp has ever pretended. He paid an enormous price either way: the Palm Springs ranch, the insurance policies, the television show, and his standing with the American public all disappeared inside 5 years, and in exchange he received a household to run, a wife who came to find him beneath contempt, and a public discarding conducted in front of every newspaper photographer in Italy. Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor repaired their friendship and lived long enough to laugh about the whole business together on camera, while Fisher kept defending himself in print in 1999 to a readership that included his own daughter, the one who wanted her genetic material disinfected.